I never imagined that a plate of food could reveal the deepest scar in my soul, nor that the past would return to exact such a high price. It was an ordinary Tuesday at Sunbeam School, one of those gray days that seemed to drag on with the same slowness as the bureaucracy that drowned us. The smell of school lunch, an indistinct mixture of beans and shredded chicken, hung in the air, promising minimal sustenance for the small, hungry bodies that filled the cafeteria. My fifth-grade class was excited, the buzz of children's voices filling the room with infectious energy, the only thing that made me love the profession despite everything. I was Professor Ana Lucia, and for 15 years I dedicated my life to those smiles, to those curious eyes, to those minds that barely knew the weight of the world that awaited them outside. That day, however, a specific pair of eyes caught my attention. It was João Pedro, a 10-year-old boy, thin, with coffee-colored hair, and a look that carried the depth of someone who has seen too much. He was sitting alone at a table in the corner, with a bitten apple in front of him and an almost empty bottle of water. The lunch plate, which was usually devoured voraciously, was untouched. I watched him for a few minutes, my heart sinking. João was one of my best students, incredibly intelligent and observant, but also the quietest, trying to blend in with the walls to not be noticed. I already knew his story, in parts. Mother who worked as a day laborer, father who was absent, difficulties that far exceeded what a child should have to endure. The principal, Dona Odette, had already mentioned that João's family was going through a particularly difficult period and that he often came to school without a decent breakfast. I approached, feeling the lump in my throat. "João, my love, why aren't you eating?" I asked, my voice soft, trying not to embarrass him. He looked up at me, a flash of shame on his pale face. "I'm not hungry, Professor," he murmured, his voice barely audible, but his stomach growled, betraying him. I saw the blush creep up his neck. My own lunch, a simple cheese sandwich and a juice box, was untouched in my bag. I always took something from home, as the teacher's food wasn't always the same as the students', and I preferred to save money. At that moment, however, the economy seemed like a crime. "Oh yeah? And your sandwich, did you eat it before you came?" I asked, knowing the answer would be no. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the apple. The break from normality came with my decision, as impulsive as it was inevitable. I broke an unwritten rule, not to give food brought from outside to students for health and safety reasons. But what health could a starving child have? I took my sandwich out of my bag, the cheese crushed on whole wheat bread. "Look, João, I prepared this one with so much care, but I just remembered that I have a meeting and I won't have time to eat. Would you agree to do me a favor and eat it for me? I don't want it to spoil." I tried to smile, but there was a bitter taste in my mouth. It was a white lie, of course, but the only way to preserve some of his dignity. John's eyes widened. He hesitated, looking at the sandwich, then at me, looking for a sign of play or pity. There were none. Just the urgency of a teacher who saw the hunger on her student's face. He picked up the sandwich with small, shaking hands. The first bite was slow, almost hesitant. Then, voracity took over. Within seconds, the sandwich disappeared, accompanied by hurried sips of his water. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a silent gratitude that was worth more than any salary I had ever received. I felt a warmth in my chest, a bittersweet feeling of doing my duty, but also of helplessness. My small gesture was a drop in the ocean of the needs of that boy and so many others. Little did I know that this small act, done in the dim light of a noisy cafeteria, would be the trigger for a storm that would force me to confront ghosts from my own past. That afternoon, reality hit me again with the force of lightning. Dona Odette called me into her office, her face lined with concern. "Ana, we need to talk about school," she began, her voice tired. I sat down, a bad feeling tightening my chest. She handed me a folder with documents. Numbers and graphs jumped out at me, all pointing in the same direction. The end. The Rio de Sol Municipal School, our refuge, our home, was sinking into debt. The City Hall's funding cuts were brutal, Ana. We can't cover basic expenses. The late electricity bill, the water threatened with being cut off, the salaries of support staff, not to mention maintenance. If we don't get a significant contribution, we will be forced to close the doors at the end of the school year, she explained, tears streaming down her face. That was turning point one. The moral and existential problem appeared not just for me, but for the entire community. My small battle against João Pedro's hunger seemed tiny compared to the gigantic battle to save the school, the future of hundreds of João Pedros. I felt a wave of despair and anger. Anger at the bureaucracy, the indifference, the injustice that allowed the future of so many children to hang by a thread. My heart hurt thinking about João, his friends, all the students who would see their only safe haven dismantled. It was a cruel injustice, a wrong decision by society that threw in the towel for those who needed it most. How could I teach them about justice and hope if the system itself stole their hope? The sandwich I gave João seemed like such an insignificant gesture now. The problem was much bigger, deeper, more systemic. I felt a chill down my spine, a feeling of helplessness that I hadn't felt in a long time. That day, which began with an act of kindness, ended with the weight of hopelessness knocking on my door. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, but the anger that had settled in my chest quickly turned into fuel. I couldn't allow the Rayo de Sol school to close. I couldn't disappoint João and his colleagues. That night, instead of resting, I spent hours researching emergency funds, sponsorship notices, anything that could shed some light. I slept little. My thoughts were racing. The image of João's face eating my sandwich mixing with the image of the debt papers in Dona Odette's room. Sleep came and brought with it memories that I preferred to keep buried. A micro-trigger, a memory revealed. The vivid image of myself, a child, feeling the same shame as João, my stomach empty, in a threadbare uniform, watching other classmates eat their lunch while I made up excuses not to go to the cafeteria. That was my past, the scar that made me so sensitive to João's pain. I knew what it was like to feel the pang of hunger and the humiliation that accompanied it. The next day, I arrived at school determined. Director Odette was even more dejected. I suggested that we set up a committee of parents and teachers to look for solutions. "We have to fight, Dona Odette. Our children deserve more than this," I said, my voice choked with emotion. She nodded, a spark of hope rekindling in her tired eyes. We started with modest fundraising campaigns, a second-hand bazaar with donations of clothes and toys, a raffle for a beauty product kit, and even a small talent show with the students themselves. Every penny was celebrated, but it was a drop in the ocean. Debt seemed like an insurmountable mountain. One sunny afternoon, while helping to organize the school library, I came across a dusty box. Inside, old photo albums, yellowed newspaper clippings. It was Extra Narrative Block 1, a piece of the school's history. But for me, at that moment, it became a mirror. In one of the photos, an image of a group of children in uniform, smiling shyly. It was a photo of the school's first class, from more than 30 years ago. My eyes swept over the children's faces until they stopped on one in particular, a boy with wild hair, curious eyes, with a tear in the knee of his uniform. He held a science book with a passion that I recognized immediately. The heart raced. I knew him. Or rather, I knew him from a distant, painful past. It was Ricardo Albuquerque, the poor, brilliant boy who studied with me as a child, at another school, in a much more humble neighborhood. We were neighbors. We lived on the same unpaved street, and we shared the same condition. But Ricardo always had a sparkle in his eyes, an intelligence that didn't seem to fit into our busy lives. I remembered one day, at recess, when the cafeteria distributed bread and butter to the children who had forgotten their lunch. I was there, with the same shame that João showed, but Ricardo, despite being hungry, offered me half of his bread. I refused. My pride hurt, saying I wasn't hungry, even though my stomach was growling. That gesture of his, and my ungrateful refusal, were engraved in my memory. Years later, he got a scholarship to a private school, disappeared from my life, and I never heard from him again. But the image of him, the outstretched bread, the generosity in the midst of scarcity, was a constant reminder of my own failure to recognize kindness, of my own inability to accept help when I needed it most. That memory tightened my chest. Richard, what would have happened to him? The days turned into weeks. Collection was slow, agonizing. Every progress was immediately overshadowed by the magnitude of the debt. Hope began to fade away. One day, while I was trying to organize a small used book fair, Dona Odette entered the room with a cautious smile on her face. "Anna, we have good news," she said, her eyes shining. "We received a donation, anonymous. It covered a significant portion of the outstanding bills. The electricity will not be cut off this week. This was turn two. The character believes he has resolved the situation, but it is a false way out. A reasonable amount, yes, but insufficient to eliminate the total debt. I felt an immense relief, a ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Verada 2 brought us a breather, an illusion of control, but the debt monster was still there, hidden, waiting to swallow us. We celebrated the small victory, but I knew deep down it was just a bandage on a deep wound. "It's a miracle, Dona Odette," I said, hugging her. But a micro-trigger of tension appeared in my thoughts. Who was this anonymous donor? And why only one part? If the person had the resources to donate so much, why not all of it? A part of me felt a pang of distrust, but most of my mind was just grateful. The news spread like wildfire in the community. Parents and students were euphoric, feeling that the school had been blessed. João, in turn, brought me a drawing. It was a small doll with a plate of food and a radiant sun. In the corner, scrawled, was written, "Thank you, teacher, for giving me strength." That small gesture, the innocence of her gratitude, reminded me why I fought. But the battle was not won. The debt was millions, and the anonymous donation, generous as it was, only covered a fraction. The deadline for full payment was approaching, and the specter of closing still hung over us. Hope, although rekindled, was fragile, like a candle flame in the midst of a storm. I found myself thinking about Ricardo again. Could it be him? Was it possible that he had become such a generous person? Or was it just a foolish thought, a faint connection from the past that my subconscious brought up in moments of fragility? Uncertainty gnawed at me, and the shadow of my own past followed me, closer than I imagined. The following days were a roller coaster of emotions. The small donation gave us a breather, but it also intensified the pressure. The deadline to pay off the full debt was approaching relentlessly, and every phone call from City Hall, every email from the education department, was a reminder of the precipice we found ourselves on. Parents, previously euphoric, began to feel anxiety again. Tension micro-triggers appeared all the time. I saw mothers crying at the school doors, worried about their children's future. I've heard comments from colleagues about miracles that don't happen twice. Even João, who seemed to have renewed his joy, became quieter again, observing the adults with an unusual seriousness for his age. He felt the tension in the air, the fragility of our temporary victory. I threw myself headlong into the search for more funds. I wrote letters, made calls, knocked on company doors in the hope of finding a generous heart. With each no, I felt a piece of my hope crumble. With each no, the memory of Ricardo, of the bread he offered me and of my proud refusal, became clearer. How could I be so blind, so ungrateful? The shame I felt for myself was almost as great as the sadness of seeing the school wither away. It was as if life was giving me a chance at redemption, to prove that I had learned from my mistakes. But I was failing. Then came the day that would change everything. I arrived at school, still drowsy, after another night of insomnia and worries. The courtyard, usually calm at this hour, was bustling. Students and parents crowded around the main entrance, whispering and gesturing. As I approached, I noticed that there was a news car parked in front of the school. Cameras and microphones pointed at the facade. My heart froze. I thought of the worst. An eviction notice. The official news of the closing. I ran to Dona Odette's office, who greeted me with teary eyes, but with a smile so wide that it almost didn't fit on her face. "Anna, you won't believe it," she exclaimed, her voice choked with emotion. She handed me a tablet, and on the screen, the headline from a local news portal jumped out. "Billionaire pays millionaire debt of Rio de Sol Municipal School, saving hundreds of children from helplessness." My knees weakened. I sat down on the nearest chair, the air running out of me. The school was saved. The debt, worth millions, had been paid off in full. Virada 3 came with an overwhelming force. The truth came to light, but with a twist that reversed roles and threw me into a whirlwind of emotions. The news story spoke of a local businessman who preferred to remain anonymous, but who had made a specific condition. He wanted to meet in person with the teacher responsible for the fundraising initiative. That is me. The joy was immense, indescribable, but soon a pang of apprehension set in. Who was this benefactor? And why the condition of meeting me? A suspicion, a faint thread of memory, began to unravel in my mind. Hours later, in the director's office, we were waiting for the mysterious billionaire. The atmosphere was charged with expectation. Dona Odette, elegantly dressed, tried to hide her nervousness, fixing her blouse tie for the 10th time. I was in a trance, my mind racing, trying to connect the dots but refusing to believe in the only possibility that insisted on imposing itself. The door opened and a tall man with an impeccable suit and a proud posture entered the room. His hair was gray at the temples, and there were a few fine lines around his eyes, but the glow was unmistakable. His eyes, that discerning intelligence, the way he held a leather briefcase. My heart stopped. The air felt thin. He wasn't just a businessman. It was Ricardo Albuquerque, the poor boy who offered me half the bread and who, in my childish pride, rejected. He looked at me directly, without a hint of emotion in his eyes, just a cold, calculating assessment. My legs almost gave out. That was the Ricardo I had known, but also a Ricardo I would never recognize on the street. He had become the billionaire, the school's savior, and my past. The role reversal was brutal. Before, we were two young people, both poor, both looking for something, he offering and I refusing. Now, he was the donor, the powerful, the benefactor, and I, the humble teacher, who depended on his charity to save my life project. The micro-trigger was Ricardo's silence, the way he waited for my reaction, as if giving me time to process the shock. There was no smile, no friendly nod of recognition, just the imposing presence of a man who knew I would recognize him, and who wanted me to feel the weight of that recognition. Anger began to mix with shame. Anger at myself, at that proud child who didn't accept help from a friend. Shame to be there, again in front of him, in a position of need, of submission. Verada 3 wasn't just a revelation, it was a punch in the gut, an unforgiving mirror that forced me to face myself, my past, and what I'd become. The irony was cruel. My act of charity towards João had been the bridge to the reunion with my own moral debt. The silence in Dona Odette's room was so heavy that I could almost touch it. Ricardo kept his gaze fixed on me, an indecipherable expression on his face. Dona Odette, oblivious to the internal storm that was raging over me, broke the ice, beaming. "Professor Ana Lucia, this is Dr. Ricardo Albuquerque, our benefactor. And Dr. Ricardo, this is the teacher who led the efforts to save the school." My voice cracked when I tried to greet him. "It's a pleasure, Dr. Ricardo," I managed to stammer, extending a trembling hand. He held it firmly, but his eyes continued to look at me, as if he were reading each of my memories. I could feel the weight of the past between us, an invisible chain that bound and constrained us. Breaking that handshake brought me back to reality, but the feeling that something much bigger was at stake kept me on alert. He then addressed Dona Odette. His voice was calm and controlled, but carried an unquestionable authority. "I'm happy to be able to help. Education is the basis of everything," he said, with a formality that seemed like a shield to me. "But, as you know, my donation came with one condition. I would like to speak to Professor Ana Lucia alone, if possible." Dona Odette looked at me, slightly surprised, but nodded. "Of course, Dr. Ricardo. I'll leave you at ease." She left the room, closing the door, and left me alone with the ghost of my past and the uncertain future of the school. Still in shock, I sat down again. Ricardo crossed his legs and faced me. "Professor Ana Lucia. Or should I call you Ana? After all, we had a past, didn't we?" His tone was neutral, but the words were a sharp blade. I felt the blush rise to my face. "Ricardo," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know it was you." He gave a small smile which didn't reach his eyes. "Obviously not. Nobody expects the poor kid on the street to become Dr. Albuquerque, right?" The irony was palpable. I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. The tension was suffocating. This was extra narrative block 2, a direct confrontation with the past. Ricardo took a small wooden box from his briefcase and opened it, revealing a yellowed newspaper clipping and a faded photo. The photo was of two children, he and I, in front of the old school eating bread and butter. L and smile for the camera. I was at the side with a distant look, almost ashamed. The newspaper clipping was from a neighborhood reading contest, where he had won and I had come second. "Do you remember that, Ana?" he asked, his voice a little softer now, but still carrying an old weight. "I was always good with words, and you, always so dedicated. I admired you a lot, you know, despite everything." His next sentence was a micro-trigger, a sentence said at the wrong moment, or rather, at the right moment, to hit me deeply. "I offered you bread that day, Ana. You refused. You said you weren't hungry. But your eyes said otherwise, and I saw the shame in them. The same shame that I saw in the eyes of João Pedro, your student, when you offered him your sandwich the other day. My mouth opened in shock. He watched me. He had watched me in the cafeteria. He continued, taking his time. I never understood why you refused. I just wanted to help. But you turned away. And then, when my family moved to the country to try their luck, I wrote to you. Several times. No letters were answered. I always imagined you were ashamed of our poverty, ashamed of being friends with someone like me. His every word was a stab. I could feel the tears building up in my eyes. No, Ricardo, I wasn't ashamed of you, I exclaimed, my voice breaking. I was ashamed of myself, of my own situation. I felt so small, so incapable. I wanted to hug you, to thank you, but pride paralyzed me, and when you left I felt even more guilty, but I didn't have the courage to respond. I failed you, I know. Turn 4 hit me hard. The emotional and moral discovery. The protagonist realizes his own failure. There, in front of Ricardo, I realized the depth of my failure, not just in refusing the bread, but in closing myself off, in letting pride consume me and moving away from someone who cared. I realized that the empathy I felt for João was, in part, an attempt to compensate for my own past failure. My actions with João, which I thought were purely altruistic, had a tinge of guilt, an unconscious need for redemption. I was trying to heal myself, through him. Ricardo's gaze, which had previously been cold, now seemed to have a spark of understanding, perhaps even shared pain. The truth came out, and it was more painful than I could have ever imagined. My kindness to João wasn't pure, it was tainted by my past, by my own failure to be truly kind and open with Ricardo when we were children. He sighed, his face softening a little. I understand shame, Anna. I've felt it many times too, but I've learned that it doesn't take us anywhere. It just takes us away from the people who could help us, who care about us. His words were a mirror that reflected my own flaws. I was there, a dedicated teacher who fought for her students, but who in her past had failed in a fundamental connection. The moral shock was profound. I, the teacher who taught classes on empathy and respect, had been the personification of pride and blindness at a crucial moment in my life. The money saved the school, but Ricardo's presence was saving my soul, unearthing the most uncomfortable truth about myself. The air in the room was heavy, but the confession, the truth that had finally broken free from within me, brought a paradoxical relief. I was exposed, vulnerable, and that somehow was liberating. Ricardo watched me, and I could see that my pain, my shame, did not satisfy him. There was something else in his gaze, an understanding perhaps, or the shadow of his own pain. I know I failed, Ricardo, I said, tears streaming freely down my face. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything. He nodded slowly. I didn't look for you to hear an apology, Anna, or to see you suffer. I looked for you because I saw you in that cafeteria, giving your lunch to a starving boy, and I saw yourself in him, and I saw myself. His words were like a balm, but also a new layer of guilt. I wasn't just redeeming myself for John, I was redeeming myself for him too. He continued, I became a billionaire, Anna, but money didn't cure everything. It gave me power, yes, but it also brought me a deep loneliness. I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot the taste of hunger. And I never forgot the boy who offered the bread and was rejected. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out into the schoolyard where children were playing, oblivious to the complexity of adult emotions. When I saw the report about the school in trouble, and then your photo leading the campaigns, something stirred inside me. The first impulse was to help, of course, but the second was to confront, to understand, see if that girl I knew, who rejected my help out of pride, was still there. He turned to me, the sunlight reflecting off his face. And she is, isn't she? The kindness you showed John is the same kindness you denied yourself, and by extension, me, that day. And that is the beauty and tragedy of our story, Anna. The internal conflict came to the surface, overwhelming. Ricardo didn't charge me the money, but a much deeper truth. He gave me an inescapable moral dilemma, choosing between my pride and true redemption, between the image of the impeccable teacher and the truth about my own flawed humanity. He then made me a proposal that shocked my soul. My donation to the school was not an isolated act, Anna. I am creating a foundation to support public schools in needy communities. I want you to be part of it. Not as just any employee, but as director of pedagogical projects. Your experience, your dedication, are invaluable. My heart raced. It was an incredible opportunity, a dream come true, a future for many other schools like Rayo de Sol. But, he continued, there is one condition. He approached my table and placed the wooden box with the photo and newspaper clipping there, right in front of me. The foundation will be launched publicly. I want you, in your speech, to tell your story. The story of Professor Ana Lucia, the dedicated leader who saved Escola Rayo de Sol, and the story of the girl Ana, who refused her friend's bread out of pride, and who today understands the true value of empathy. I want you to present yourself not as a perfect heroine, but as someone who learned and grew from her mistakes. I want you to face your own shame publicly and let this serve as an example for others. My breath caught in my throat. It was an ultimatum, not financial, but moral. The emotional climax unfolded inside me. Accepting it meant destroying the image of perfection that I had built. It meant exposing myself, humiliating myself in front of millions of people. It meant admitting that behind the teacher who fought for others, there was a woman with her own flaws and deep regrets. It was a choice between my pride and the legacy I could build for thousands of children. It was between my conscience and my reputation. Ricardo's power was not just in his money, but in his ability to force me to look within, to dissect every piece of my soul. I could see João Pedro in my mind, the sandwich in his hands. I could see little Ricardo extending the bread to me. And I could see myself, the woman I wanted to be, the woman I should have been. And if it were you, would you have the courage to do the same in the face of such a huge abyss? I thought, addressing the spectator, my throat dry. The choice was clear, but the difficulty of executing it was immense. Pride, that old and treacherous emotion, tried to hold me back. He whispered to me to refuse, to keep my scars hidden, to take credit for saving the school and move forward without the weight of the past. But the image of João, the image of little Ricardo, the image of my own truth, were stronger. I didn't want to be a facade heroine. I wanted to be a real person, a person who learns from her mistakes, who embraces vulnerability in the name of something greater. I felt a hot tear run down my face, not from sadness, but from a complex mix of shame, relief, and a strange kind of peace. My throat tightened. The past was taking its toll on me, yes, but he was also giving me a chance, a real chance, a chance to be the teacher I truly dreamed of being. Not just for my students, but for myself. I looked at Ricardo, my eyes fixed on his. What he saw there, I didn't know, but I knew what I saw. I saw a bridge between the past and the future, between pride and forgiveness. Still in front of Ricardo, with the wooden box on the table symbolizing the weight of my decision, I took a deep breath. Time seemed to have stopped. My mind revisited every moment, every failure, every regret. I felt the lump in my throat, but this time, it wasn't from paralyzing shame, but from a deep and complex emotion that bordered on catharsis. I looked at the photo of little Ricardo, the outstretched bread, and at my own image, elusive and proud. I could no longer run away from that version of myself. I accept, I said, voice cracking but firm. I agree to be part of your foundation, Ricardo, and I agree to tell my story, the complete truth, to the world, so that my childhood shame becomes a life lesson for other people. The last words came out with a sigh. The air seemed to enter my lungs again after years of suffocation. I felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The Ricardo's face softened. There was no triumph in his gaze, but something that looked like peace, and perhaps a reciprocal understanding. Thank you, Ana, he said, and this time there was genuine emotion in his voice. Thank you for having the courage. At that moment, there was the climax, the psychological and moral collapse that tore me apart emotionally and rebuilt me at the same time. I cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. I cried for my past failures, for the ignorance of that proud girl, for the pain I caused myself and, indirectly, Ricardo. But I also cried for the redemption he offered me, for the opportunity to transform a scar into a lighthouse. Justice was being served, but with a profound emotional loss, the loss of my illusion of perfection, of my mask as an unquestionable heroine. And this loss, I realized, was necessary so that I could truly be free. Days later, the Rio de Sol Municipal School was officially saved. A grand ceremony was organized with the presence of the press and authorities. Ricardo Albuquerque, the billionaire, was hailed as the great benefactor, and I, Professor Ana Lucia, went up on stage to speak. I took a deep breath, looking at the crowd of parents, students, colleagues, and at Ricardo, who was watching me with an attentive look. I started talking about the importance of school, about the struggle, about hope. And then, with my voice breaking, I began to tell my story. "I'm Professor Ana Lucia," I said, looking directly at the camera, at the world. "And I am living proof that life gives us second chances. Many years ago, I was a poor child, full of pride and shame. One day a friend, also very poor, offered me a piece of his bread. I refused. I said I wasn't hungry, but my stomach was growling. My pride prevented me from accepting kindness, from seeing the humanity in my friend's gesture. And today, I am here, before you, to confess that that flaw, that blindness, accompanied me for years. I lived with the guilt, with the shame of not being the person I should have been." The words flowed, full of emotion. I talked about João Pedro, about the sandwich, and about how this act of kindness, which I thought was purely altruistic, took me back to my own past. I spoke about Ricardo, about the man he became, about the strength of forgiveness and truth. Virada 5 was completed there, in front of everyone. The school was saved, the debt was paid, but the price of my personal redemption was the exposure of my vulnerability, and I paid that price willingly. The audience, initially in shock, soon surrendered to the emotion. I could see tears in the eyes of many. At the end of my speech, there was a profound silence, followed by a thunderous ovation. Ricardo came on stage and hugged me, a hug of true forgiveness and partnership. That hug was worth more than all the money in the world. The ending never explained everything. There was no simplistic, happily ever after. The school prospered, yes. Ricardo's foundation, with my leadership, expanded, saving other institutions. João Pedro continued to be a brilliant student, and I, a more complete, more human teacher. I carried my scars, but they were no longer sources of shame. They were constant reminders of the importance of truth, humility, and true empathy. Have you also lost someone because of pride? I would ask myself in my moments of reflection, looking at the old photo of Ricardo and me. Or, for fear of looking back, the question would echo, reminding me that money in itself is not the answer, but rather a catalyst that reveals the true essence of people. My relationship with Ricardo turned into a partnership of mutual respect, a bond forged in adversity and truth. He continued to be the billionaire, and I, the teacher. But the hierarchy between us had changed. We were equal in our humanity, our flaws, and our desire to do good. And in the end, as I looked at João Pedro running across the courtyard, with a full plate of lunch and a promising future, I asked myself, the bank account was intact, the debt was paid off, but the heart of the person who had really paid the highest price? Mine, for the exposed shame, or Ricardo's, for having carried the weight of resentment for so long, to finally find a way of forgiveness. Comment here. What would you have done if your past knocked on the door with a check in one hand and your conscience in the other?